How is it in Dubai, Jean, now? They're opening?
Well, they are. I'm in Abu Dhabi though. I'm about 45 minutes away.
Okay.
But they are opening, and they have very strict controls on the percent of people who can be in the malls, the stores, that kind of thing.
Okay.
Tom, how do you say your last name?
Teixeira. Yeah, Tom Teixeira.
Teixeira. Nice name.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a famous player for the New York Yankees with the same name, so I always used to get a lot of questions every time I used to go stateside.
I have the impression that's Portuguese origin, is it?
Yeah, it's Portuguese. Yeah, correct.
Gentlemen, I'm seeing that the attendees are coming in, and I think to keep the time, we need to start. So I welcome everybody. Thank you very much for sharing your knowledge with us. And for delegates, we welcome everybody who's participating. And I think it's very good to start now. I think, one second, I see. Okay. We will start with you, Tom. You're all set. And I will introduce Tom as a practice leader for risk and resilience. And he's an Arthur D. Little partner. He has more than 25 years risk management experience, both in senior consulting and operational roles. Areas of expertise include risk-based strategic planning and forecasting, risk analysis and quantification, business continuity management, total cost of risk reduction strategies, including insurance and captive management. Also, he has expertise in governance, risk, and compliance technology platform. So I will leave the stage for you. You may start, Tom.
Alan Nasey, thank you very much for your introduction. Welcome, everyone. Honored, to be asked to present today on resilience, and risk. As was said, my name's Tom Teixeira. I'm a practice lead at Arthur D. Little. So I run the risk and resilience practice. And the whole idea is to ensure we can use risk and resilience to drive performance improvement. Now, in terms of Arthur D. Little, it's the oldest established consultancy in the world, started in 1886. And our focus is ensuring that we can link strategy to technology, to innovation, to transformation, to make sure that at the end of the day, we can drive the strategy and we can drive performance improvement. And risk and resilience tends to be an intricate part of that process. So in terms of the session today, I really want to cover three areas. I want to cover, the first area is learnings from a number of CEOs that I had the privilege to interview as a result of the COVID crisis. And they came out with some very interesting conclusions, learnings around the COVID experience, but also considering the beyond. So I want to quickly cover those learnings with you as the first item. And then secondly, cover off some of the potential solutions that were raised, that were discussed, both from a COVID approach, but again, as I said earlier, beyond COVID. And then finally, finish up with some thoughts and with some conclusions. So in terms of the CEO perspective, a few weeks ago, we set out to interview a number of CEOs in the Asia Pacific region, focusing primarily on countries that had either gone through COVID, but also had been affected by SARS. So we talked to a number of CEOs in Hong Kong and in Singapore, and we also wanted to get the perspective of CEOs that were suffering pain, that were in the middle of crisis management. So again, we had the opportunity to interview a number in Italy. In terms of the sectors, we were focusing primarily on telco, logistics, utilities, particularly around power generation, for example. And as I said, there were a number of interesting findings. In relation to the type of questions that we asked, I just want to give you a flavor of what we focused on. One was, up until that point, the impact that COVID-19 had on their organization, on their company, what they had done, what they still needed to do in terms of responding to the immediate challenges. As a result of what had again been done to date, what were the key learnings that they identified, and how would they then take those learnings forward? Personal leadership challenges, both in the past and what they were trying to focus on today, and then a focus on the rapid recovery. What were the key elements that they needed to take forward? What was the upside, if any, that they saw as a result of this pandemic? So that gives you an understanding of the questions. They come up with some overall findings, so I'll cover those first, and then go into a little bit more detail around the risk and resilience. So they felt that, crisis steering, they needed to mobilize, crisis response leadership immediately, using tested and drilled plans. A lot of them thought that those plans were still fit for purpose. Many found that the business continuity plans they had in place were outdated, didn't necessarily mirror the operating model, and were very, very challenging indeed. And they had to then adopt an approach where they could take early decisions in the process because of the problems with those recovery plans. They also then wanted to focus on stakeholders, and they prioritized their stakeholders. And first of all, the focus was on employees and customers, making sure that they're safe, making sure that lines of communication were open and they could adapt to the new norm that was being felt. On the operational and business continuity side, they also felt it was important to separate teams in case certain teams, again, got infected. There was always Team B to come in and cover off any of the operations that then needed supported, and then making sure that other partners that they had within the organization and suppliers were also aligned. So that was the second priority. And finally, the other stakeholders, the third priority, was also to actively engage with government, with authorities, with the local community to make sure there was complete alignment. And from the recovery perspective, they also felt that there were positives to be had. There were new opportunities that could be grasped. And again, I'll provide a little bit more detail of that in a minute. So again, in terms of the new norm, because I've covered that, in my title. So, we had the virtual work experience, the virtual environment experience. There was a real need to build on that, to extend the smart working approach and understand what that meant in terms of culture and in terms of data systems and technology. So what that then led to is the need or recognition that, they're going to have to increase automation. They're going to have to increase the level of flexible working. And of course, online services, again, increasing the functionality on that in terms of working with customers, working with the supply chain, and the ability to make sure that everything was properly linked as part of an overall ecosystem. They also felt that we've got to be better at taking quick, short-term, effective decisions. Okay. A lot of the organizations realized there was a static approach in their organizations in terms of the decision making and the need to be more dynamic. And that's quite key to what I'm going to say later on. They also felt too, with the way things were panning out, that there would be new merger and acquisition opportunities, arising from the shakeout and from the consolidation. But also, and I think this is key, better crisis management preparedness. Okay. Whilst a number of organizations that we interviewed had learned lessons from the SARS outbreak and had applied those lessons and were able to maintain their business, others failed dismally. And the CEOs were quite frank and admitted to that and felt they've got to have a more focused approach. So what I would say is that the word risk, the word business resilience, continuity crisis management is at the forefront of executive committees and at the forefront of the minds of the board. So if we now move to the business resilience side, and the feedback that, again, that we received from these CEOs, there was a need for a common business resilience framework. Again, those that had big organizations realized that there was a lack of commonality in terms of approach, in terms of business processes, in terms of the techniques and the data that was being collated. And in many times, it was very difficult to collate a lot of that data and try and understand what the data was actually saying. From the risk management point of view, as I said earlier, there needed to be a more dynamic approach. They also admitted that in relation to the business continuity plans that they had in place, they needed to be stress tested. The businesses are changing all the time in this global environment, and the business, and therefore your operating models are changing. And if you have plans in place, they need to reflect the new operating model, and they understood that. And then there's also a need to better understand this other dimension of risk, which we call risk velocity. Again, I'll go into a little bit more detail about what we mean, but the speed at which this risk emerged, the speed at which the risk impacted the business, and then the speed at which it was felt across the business was something that they completely underestimated. And there are tools and techniques that we can use to help us better understand this third dimension of risk velocity. So I want to go on to the second section of this presentation to now look at some of the approaches. Some you may recognize already, and there might be some nuances, some enhancements, some changes around those methodologies. But I just wanted to give you a feel of, so what are we actually talking about based on the feedback that we had over the last few weeks? We talked about an integrated framework. So what does an integrated framework look like? Organizations have a business plan, they have a strategy. Against that business plan, there'll be objectives and there'll be key performance indicators. There is a clear need to understand the threat of not achieving that business plan, of not achieving those objectives. What is the size of the threat? What does it mean in financial terms? And that's something, again, that the CEOs that we interviewed struggled. Many had no idea of the size of the financial impact that COVID-19 was to have on their businesses, which was really interesting. Reputational impact is something else that also needs to be, considered. So it's about better understanding the risk across the business, understanding how that risk could be aggregated and how it could be correlated to get a true understanding of how it could then affect the delivery of the over the overall business plan. So there were a number of components in relation to that. One, again, was looking at the internal control system and looking at remedial actions. But what they also felt was a key part of this new framework is then focusing also on recovery and crisis management. And then thirdly, they all realized that you cannot have zero risk. It's impossible to have zero risk. There will always be a certain amount of risk left. And once you've controlled and you've transferred some of that through the right mitigation strategies, there are opportunities to effectively transfer the rest of that risk, through insurance transfer. So some of it you may need to accept, because if you're going to be a competitive organization in this new norm, in this new environment, you've got to accept risk on the balance sheet. But some of that other risk could now be transferred to the insurance market. Understanding how much you transfer, what you need to transfer now becomes key in this new norm. But what I want to do is focus on the recovery and the crisis management element. So again, some of you may have seen this. I mean, there is a sequence to the various activities that you need to take. I'm not going to cover the full sequence here, but it's all about planning. And then if the situation, if the crisis happens, you've got the immediate response that you need to take care of. You've then got a crisis management phase, and then you're recovering the business to try and get back up to full operating capacity. But I also want to consider a couple of things in the planning side, because this is where there was a shortfall. The need to undertake, right at the start of the process, effective business impact assessments. Have a clear understanding of what your key processes, key assets, key individuals are, and therefore have relevant criteria, whether it's financial criteria, health, safety, and environment criteria, that you have a clear understanding that if you were to lose an asset or a key process, what would be the impact of the business? So many felt had an inconsistent approach to agreeing the criteria that they used as part of their impact, their impact assessment. The other area, as I think I referred to before, was the testing and the maintenance. Again, in many cases, these plans were developed, crisis management plans are in place, business continuity plans are in place, and they got the big tick in the box and felt, we're going to be okay. But no, the plans were not tested, the business model changed, the operating model changed, and when it came time to enact the plans, they were not fit for purpose. So there was a clear need, a clear understanding to make sure that we test these plans, but then there is plan maintenance to ensure that these plans are updated in accordance to the way we're changing our business. And therefore, there is a clear, there's a level of integration that needs to be considered between the risk management process and the business continuity and crisis management. There are many touch points. And from an organizational concept, again, I'm a firm advocate that risk management, business continuity, crisis management, they need to be part of the same, what I would call business resilience function. I've been in far too many organizations where these functions are completely separate and in some cases do not communicate with each other, leading to major issues in terms of communication when the crisis actually happens. So as I said, there are a lot of touch points where data can be shared, and I just want to give you an example of that in the next slide. So this is based on a project that I was involved in where there was a real need to look at lean processes, streamlined processes, and efficiency. And so there were two separate functions at the time, a business continuity management function, a risk management function, and it's how do we bring these functions closer together? What are the touch points in terms of sharing of data that we need to be considered? So if we look at the business continuity process here on the right, and we're trying to identify key assets and processes, as part of that process, people will consider risk. How are we going to lose this asset? How much damage are we going to take on board? All of that information that gets identified in that business impact assessment is very valuable and should be shared with the risk management community as well, and could be then integrated into their risk profiles and their reporting mechanisms. If there's any mitigation being put in place, that needs to be fed back to the business continuity process, community as well. And any actions that are in place to avoid losses, very important for both communities. Again, important information that needs to be shared. And in fact, in relation to certain strategies as well around the risk management process, again, as those strategies are being implemented and updated, useful information that can be fed back into the business continuity process. So all we're trying to say here is there's got to be an integrated approach. You can create a streamlined approach, as you see here, between the two processes, because there are a lot of touch points and because there's a lot of commonality in the type of data that you need to keep the business going. So going back to the previous slide, it's about prevention and recovery and making sure that those processes are properly integrated. The final thing that I want to add, and this is not necessarily COVID related, it wasn't a big issue in the COVID scenario, but it goes back to the streamlining. It goes back to efficient and effective use of resources. And again, in my experience with a number of different organizations that I've worked with, you have IT disaster recovery, again, as one function. You have business continuity, crisis management as another function. And where I've seen this work really well is to create proper business resilience, you integrate the two capabilities. So ISO 22301, that relates to IT disaster recovery. You've then got the international standard in relation to business continuity management. If you work closely with the various stakeholders in the organization, those people involved with IT, those people involved with the business, you can actually integrate the approach. And again, create a more streamlined process, because IT disaster recovery, the loss of IT, the loss of elements within your IT environment will lead to a loss of business. will lead to business interruption, will lead to additional cost of working. So you need to bring those communities more closely together. And what I mean by here is this is just a schematic that shows that if it's done properly on the left, you have an understanding of your key processes. Okay, you have an understanding that if you lose those key processes, what are the potential impacts on the organization? But more important, with this integrated approach, you will also understand the dependency that these key processes have on various elements of the IT infrastructure, the IT estate that you've got to be managed. In most cases, there's a complete dependency. But as I found with some of the organization I was working with, I mean, they might have had, let's say, 8 key critical business processes. We found in this case, this was a well-known real estate investment trust, that 7 of those key business processes relied on a server on the other side of London in an unlocked room under a dripping air conditioning system. Had that server been lost, they would have lost 7 key business processes, and that would have created not just a financial impact for that organization, but a reputational impact as well. So all I want to say here is, whilst this was not really COVID related, trying to integrate IT disaster recovery into that overall ecosystem resilience framework, I believe it, is a sensible thing to do. The final thing that I want to cover here in terms of the sort of integrated business resilience approach is the need for organizations that they may have the framework in place, but I would recommend that on a regular basis, benchmark yourselves or assess yourselves in terms of maturity. So all you see here is a lot of information that covers the business continuity crisis management process, but a lot of questions are asked, which allows you to get an understanding across your various businesses in your overall organization, the level of business continuity maturity you have. It's also worth benchmarking how you're doing against other organizations within your sector, but also against other organizations in different sectors. And on the top right-hand side, in terms of being able to drive culture effectively, it is a good idea to look at these maturity models and look at maturity scores and decide by a certain date that you will have all of your businesses at a certain level of maturity. And we've always recommended make sure that that level of maturity includes the need to stress test the various scenarios, to stress test your plans, which you can see down here on the right. So benchmarking yourselves as an organization, undertaking regular maturity assessments to see if you're achieving effectively that target and you're driving culture change effectively, again, is a strong recommendation. So what I want to quickly do to finish off this section is bring in a couple of additional items. I mentioned earlier this concept of risk velocity. Now, one of the things that we really do need to be clear that alarms me slightly is people think, oh, well, COVID-19 was a black swan. It wasn't a black swan. If you look on risk lists, risk registers of many companies, pandemic is there. Pandemic was a key risk for the British government, but not a lot was done about it. They just felt we've got to record it. It's low probability, high impact. Let's record it. But did we actually do something about that? And the concept of velocity, in other words, an emerging risk, how quickly it emerges, and then how quickly it migrates from emerging to a defined risk that then impacts your business and promulgates itself across that business at high velocity, is really, really important to understand. And again, you've got a number of different dimensions here. On the y-axis, the level of control effectiveness that you might have at emerging risk level. That's the excuse that a number of organizations have had. Yes, we did have pandemic on our risk register, but we didn't really understand it, to the need to improve the knowledge base, which is on the x-axis, to move from a vague situation to a more established situation so that risk gets defined. But I think that the problem, and I found this talking with CEOs in Hong Kong, they had no idea of the speed this happened. It was very, very quick indeed. So we do need to understand this third dimension of velocity. Now, how do we get over that? And again, what the methodology that I'm coming here for is based very much on requirements that came out of these CEO meetings, that came out also workshops, is look, we've been doing risk management, business continuity for ages. Okay? We still get it wrong. We're supposed to be good at this, but we still get it wrong and we're not prepared. What we really need is a mechanism that can sense and respond what's going on in our operations. We need metrics that are relevant to show what is emerging, where is it emerging, how quickly is it emerging, so that we become more forward facing. We can create a forward facing platform mechanism using the concept of lead indicators, in this case what we would call key risk indicators, that would then give us the red flags if certain thresholds would be exceeded. It doesn't mean that the risk's happening, but it's giving us that warning system. And then with these indicators that we're measuring around the business, we then have the concept, we'll get a better understanding of the velocity, and we can also then have a more of an adaptive response approach. The really important thing is to be able to take effective key decisions in the short term based on what the metrics are telling us to stop that problem from happening in the first place. But if it does, we know how severe it is, and we can get that continuity plan, that recovery, well, get that crisis management plan right, and then get up to full operating capacity as quickly as possible. So to summarize that, it's if we look at the top here, it's increasing the value of data that we have, and clearly that can be complex, but it's also moving from a situation of hindsight, where we want to quite early on create insight to help the business make decisions, and then move to a situation of foresight. So, many companies still operating on the left-hand side, they do have their methodologies, their mechanisms in place. I find that post a dramatic event, then they do a diagnostic and a deep dive. We want to try and avoid that from happening in the first place. And therefore, we also need to move in this new norm to an environment that's a lot more predictive and a lot more prescriptive, in the sense that we've got an early warning mechanism in place. And the way that data is presented allows us to make decisions. So when I talk about data, it's not data in the raw sense of the word. We're trying to create an ability here of transforming data into information and then into insight, and present it in a way at senior management level and at operating level that can then support the decision-making process. And in many cases, again, if we look on the left-hand side, there was always a focus on lagging indicators, reporting against the KPIs. What we want to try and do now in this new norm is introduce the concept of leading indicators. It has been around for years. It just needs to be properly implemented. Bring in this concept of the use of key risk indicators and use more of an automated approach. Now, the reason why I say that is these methodologies, as I've said, have been around. They have failed in the past because of the amount of data that you need to deal with. And trying to do this now, particularly in this new norm, this new environment that we're all going to operate under, it is a big challenge. And therefore, we're looking at automated solutions. And what I mean by automated solutions, I'm talking about, for example, the application of artificial intelligence and machine learning to help us better understand which are the lead indicators that we should be monitoring in our business. And in some cases, those lead indicators aren't simple, so there's correlation. There's a relationship between some of these lead indicators that could lead to one that you've never really thought about. And so at the end of the day, as I said, reasons why these applications, these approaches have not always been successful in the past is because of the amount of data that organizations are faced with. They need to create an environment that, as I said, transforms that data into information, into insight. And therefore, to do this properly and to do it in an integrated fashion, we do also need to consider the type of IT environment, the kind of dashboards, the platforms that we're going to need to bring all of this data together and make sense of it. And what I will say from my own personal experience, in many cases, a lot of this data already exists within your organization. It just needs to be understood, interpreted, and needs to be extracted, collated, aggregated, etc. But it's there. You also need to rely on some external data that can be found. There are a lot of different data sources that you can get your hands on now that you can subscribe to, but you've got to then bring this together in a concise fashion so that it then makes sense. So don't forget, don't ignore the systems, the IT environment approach to helping create this integrated resilience approach. So finally, what I want to do now, as I said, it's really cover some conclusions and some final thoughts. They're not in any particular order. But the first one is that there's no doubt that there has to be a much more integrated approach in relation to the risk management function and bringing together the business and creating a sort of integrated risk management business continuity function under what I would call a business resilience capability. Lots of synergies to be had. The second point, as I said, a lot of data, it needs to be analyzed. A lot of that data already exists within your environment. There are effective IT solutions, mechanisms, and technology out there that allows you to collate that data effectively and understand what it's really telling you, getting that one version, as I say, of the truth. Yeah. Looking at the maturity of your integrated business resilience framework, occasionally benchmarking against what could be considered leading practice with organizations within your own sector or in other sectors. Again, it's useful to do. The fourth point here is one that I haven't touched a lot on, but I think to me it is very important in terms of getting senior management buy-in and attention. There's the concept that I've used many times called the total cost of risk approach. People within the business resilience function, risk management, business continuity are always under pressure to demonstrate tangible benefits, financial tangible benefits of doing these things. With this kind of approach now, you can develop a formula that is fit for purpose, fit for your organization, that allows you to collate data, report that data in financial terms to show that everything you're doing from a business resilience perspective is having a positive effect. Even if it's the number of losses or near misses going down, because you've now improved the quality of controls across your operations, that can be collated, that can be reported on. The type of integrated framework that I've just presented is very much welcomed by the insurance industry. So when they can see a proper integrated approach, data sharing, one version of the truth, there are, as I've seen many times, a real opportunity to significantly reduce the level of insurance premium because you can see everything that's joined up. And finally, as I said really right at the start, this is about, for your organization, trying to achieve a balance between the level of risk that you're going to take. You are going to have to take a certain amount of risk, the amount that you will need to physically mitigate out of your organization, and of what's left, how much of that could you then transfer to the insurance market to make sure that at the end of the day, you can drive business performance for your organization. And so the final point, and the one at the bottom is, this requires focus, it requires time and resources to make sure that at the same time, as an integrated approach, you're focusing both on prevention and recovery. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm open for questions if anyone's got anything they want to ask.
Thank you, Tom, for this presentation. I see some questions coming in the chat. You may be able to see it now, Tom. There is a question from. Do you see the questions?
No, I don't.
Okay.
I would just.
Okay, we have a question. How do you envision using the data through computer systems or dedicated analysts running various scenarios?
That's a very good question. So
okay.
I've recently been involved with two projects, travel and transportation and the pharmaceutical, where the big challenge here is, as you quite rightly say, is identifying the right scenarios and then using artificial intelligence and machine learning to predict what is really, what was going to happen over the next 2 to 3 months. So how do you identify the data? You look at certain scenarios for your organization and undertake what you would call a cause and effects analysis. Quite a detailed one. And you could go down to 6 or 7 levels of causation. I was involved, with a number of these studies. And if you go down to that level of detail, for example, you will identify activities that you then need to monitor that can then be ingested into the artificial intelligence and machine learning environment. For example, I was asked to do a deep dive following a well-known shipping logistics company had a major cyber breach 2 years ago and posted a $300 million loss. They were quite defensive at the time when I went in and did the deep dive and said, oh no, we're monitoring all of this data. We're monitoring the right data. When we did the deep dive and did the cause and effects analysis, at level 6 of the causation tree, we identified the timeliness of the application of security patches. And they realized that a number of they were not monitoring this. And one organization in particular, one business unit, was poor at the timeliness of application of the security patches. Had they been monitoring it, they could have avoided that breach in the first place. Not guaranteed, but they could have avoided it. So just to answer your question, the best way to identify the type of data that you need is decide on the scenarios that you need to focus on initially and undertake a cause and effects analysis.
Okay. For anyone who has a question, as I said in the chat, the message, you can just use the raise hand facility, and we will allow speaking. So you may speak to the speaker directly. So if that suits you, just raise the hand, and I will give you I will allow the speaking. I have a question from Khalid Khayyat. How can you apply the predictive concept of leading indicators on crises like pandemic or natural disasters, etc.?
So in terms of the crisis itself, lead indicators are less about the crisis because the problems happen. You might be monitoring lead indicators anyway. With natural disasters, it's a good question. I'm not allowed to name the client, but I can give you again an example of a recent case study that I've been involved with. Was a mass transit organization in the Far East. And were worried about operational disruption. And this was in relation to falling trees on tracks. If a tree falls on a track, it creates a delay, financial impact, reputational impact with the customer community. What we're able to do is then look at static risk data and dynamic. Static risk data was the configuration of the trees, the gradients, the type of soil, the distance that the trees were from the overhead lines and the tracks. A lot of data that could be ingested to give you an understanding of the overall configuration. And then you have the dynamic data, which was up-to-date weather prediction within a few hours. You combine those two, and quite quickly, we were in a position to create a dashboard that gave early warning indications. So if you can imagine the tracks that you're operating and managing lighting up as a heat map, turning red for segments of 100 meters, saying with the incoming weather, natural weather that we've got, go and cut those trees down on that segment of track to prevent the crisis with a number of trees then falling on the track. So clearly it took a lot of data, both static and dynamic, but these days, if you're worried, and clearly the weather and wind would have a big impact in this case, in terms of being a driver that would create the tree from falling on the track. So you're able to combine these various elements now to create a much more dynamic, what we would call dashboard or platform, to allow quick decisions that would then support the maintenance team to making sure that we're using the right resources in the right place.
Okay, I think we have a question from Hani Sayer. You may start.
Thank you, Tom. Really, I like the slide for planning and testing of business continuity plan. But as you mentioned, there is a lot of stakeholder, they work in this plan. Is there any system can monitoring this business continuity plan?
So again, I can just give you the examples that I've worked with. And in fact, something I didn't say actually at the start, I've done a lot of work in the region, particularly in Saudi, with Aramco and SABIC, and then in Dubai with Dubai Aluminium, for example. And when we were looking at these things, they had already procured, and I remember even Tadawul, the Saudi stock exchange, had done the same thing. They had procured what they were calling enterprise risk management systems, or governance, risk, and compliance. Now, in these systems, you have to model your assets and key processes. But it was all about risk. But now these systems have come to a level of sophistication and flexibility that against the modeled assets and key processes, you can actually then link your up-to-date business continuity plans, crisis management plans as well. And I remember, a few years ago, working with the chief operating officer of Nestle, who said, if we lose some of our assets in the coffee producing sector, we lose market share within 2 weeks. So I need a dashboard that shows all of my assets in the coffee making business, that shows the current risks, be they natural causes, risks related to manpower, et cetera, against those various assets. And I also want to have access. I want a red light system against which assets do not have business continuity plans, or for those that had the business continuity plans, which ones were stress tested and when were they stress tested, and whether it was a desktop exercise or if it was a physical stress test. In these kind of systems today, some people call them governance, risk, and compliance systems or enterprise risk management tools. You can now collate that data and bring it all together under one asset or key process structure. And as I said, have a warning mechanism as to if they haven't been updated within a year, they haven't been stress tested within a year, it's easy to create a traffic light system to say, we need to investigate because nothing's been done against this asset or key process.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I don't see any more questions now, so I think
I have a question still.
Okay, it's yours.
Yes, I was a bit astonished about the statement that this crisis emerged so quickly. It took weeks, months, whatever, as compared to a power cut or a tsunami or a landslide, which is really quick, where from 1 second to the next you have to react and you're in the middle of the crisis. Why were people perceiving this crisis to be coming quickly upon them?
I think, look, I think it's an interesting. I mean, they felt they were listening, hearing things in other parts of the world. Mm-hmm. So Italy could see what was happening in China and didn't really react. But when you think of the Italian situation, to them, when we're considering here weeks, we're not considering hours, as you say. We're not considering minutes. Yeah. But to them, that was quick. I think there was a dimension. There was a dimension here that it was how quick it actually impacted their supply chain and their business. So again, speaking to CEOs, like a head of a major utility in Singapore, when they were interested in this concept of velocity, and in this case, what they hadn't expected so quickly was reduction in their workforce, because their workforce was coming over from Malaysia and from China, and the border shut. And they hadn't realized how quick a depletion in their workforce, not giving them the capability to maintain their assets, it was a few days. It was a few days, but and then the impact across their business, how quickly their business felt it, because they clearly admitted that the plans that they had in place were out of date. I mean, I'm not saying this was the case for every organization. In some organizations, they learned well from the SARS pandemic, and things worked, and they got full up to operating capacity, operating full capacity quite quickly. Others were oblivious. Oh, but we have it on our risk list. We have the word pandemic. What does that mean?
Nobody thought it out, yes. Okay.
And so there was the velocity issue, but also a lack of understanding of the financial impact. And that's what surprised me, that many, because of disruption to their workforce, disruption to their supply chain, now are talking tens of millions, but admitted that they had no idea what impact that would have financially to their business.
The feeling of velocity or immediacy was amplified by the impact. Yes, if it would have been
Correct.
a small thing which could be handled, okay, then yeah, it was manageable, it was slow, but because of the impact, the relative feeling was it was a surprise. Yeah.
Correct. Exactly right.
And not
exactly right.
thinking of that the crisis would really hit them. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. We're good.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a question. Is it possible to rehash on the risk volatility for the current pandemic at COVID-19 with the current petroleum pricing? I think this is the last question. Yeah.
Yeah. One of my colleagues, because we do, as I said, we do a lot of work in the oil and gas sector, particularly in the GCC area. What we've been asked to do by a number of organizations, oil and gas, and in this case, I'm working on a project now with a pharmaceutical company, is exactly what you're saying. They want now to model the risk, model the COVID risk on their revenues. So again, apologies for not using an oil and gas. I have got expert colleagues that could provide more insight and a better understanding of that. But if you can think of pharmaceutical companies have to develop drugs and get them to market as quickly as possible. They have to have clinical trials. They have to try it on a number of patients. COVID-19 could be a threat to the number of patients that are being tested. Okay, so in other words, they're using the artificial intelligence and machine learning to predict which countries are stabilizing, which countries is infection going down, and in which countries is the infection increasing. So if they have operations in countries where the infection is increasing, they will stop that clinical operation there and ramp up the operation in the country where it's decreasing. So that's, again, near-time decision-making. But all of that is now going to feed into what we will call a risk model that will now, as I said earlier, model the financial impact as a result of the COVID scenario. Because again, a number of these organizations, particularly at senior level, particularly, for example, this pharmaceutical organization, doesn't really understand the potential financial impact that this current scenario has on future earnings. So it's about looking into the future. It's about, you have a base case revenue curve or an EBITDA, and then now there's enough information to put this into a risk model and what we call shock the curve to understand best case, expected case, and worst case scenarios. So again, established methodologies, but looking at a bit more using ML and artificial intelligence. But I'm seeing a real need now to understand the financial impact as a result of the COVID scenario.
Thank you very much. And I think we need to move on to the next presentation. We will have Dr. Wolfgang Maher, who has 30 years of experience in consulting and project management in the ICT environment. And during the last 25 years, he has specialized in the field of business continuity management. He is experienced in IT, governance, information security, business management, marketing, account, and product management, in professional education as an author of educational content and international speaker. Okay, Dr. Maher.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, your kind words. It's a pleasure to continue on the tone which we just heard from Tom, in that we have to, first of all, react to the current crisis. And my organization, the BCI, has run a couple of international surveys on what measures actually have been implemented by organizations in different countries around the globe. And for me, it was interesting to learn that this is a topic to discuss, because I just read the answers of this survey, but this is just not very interesting and not very descriptive. So let's discuss what actually has been done and what's behind the questions and the answers. So there's a series of these what's called preparedness reports. I think it's now the 4th edition. It was done every 2 weeks, and as I said, it has enjoyed several hundred respondents from 60 countries, roughly 20 industries around the world. I think the peak was with the 2nd and 3rd edition. Maybe not everyone has participated in the 4th edition as well, but it doesn't matter. The substance is here. Just for questions of or issues of space, on the screen there are certain abbreviations like COMS, which means means of communications, and WFH is work from home. I don't know if this abbreviation is already been general knowledge, but it may maybe end up in dictionaries and in glossaries as well. Okay, there are about 80 questions which are in this survey. We only can tackle a fraction of them. It would just take too much time to discuss each and every one in great detail. The survey was divided in 5 areas. The first one is HR, staff measures. What are the people aspects? How do you deal with your staff? What has to be undertaken? What organizational issues do we face? These are 18 questions. Second one is health and hygiene. Also dealing with human beings, of course, but more focusing on what's on the health side, which probably was in decline. I remember 10 years ago when I last did a pandemic plan for a company, we said, okay, use sanitizers, do thoroughly wash your hands. And there were many sanitizers all over the world, in hotels, in convention halls, in public buildings, but they got fewer and fewer. And as we just heard from Tom, nobody believed that we would be in a position where this would be necessary again. Everyone pushed it away and said, okay, now we remove it, we don't service it anymore. But now it's quite important again. Okay, then a classic is, of course, travel or the loss of travel. What to do, how to manage the situation without being allowed and being able to travel. Then number 4, IT, technology and telecoms, the technological backbone of each and every enterprise. Now under more stress with some organizations with more work from home. Organizations have been more or less prepared for that. So we will find out what they actually have undertaken. Then the next classic, supply chain. We also heard in the preceding presentation, this was a surprise surprise for many companies, many organizations. And then the good old continuity plans, how they worked or fared during this crisis. Again, there were about 80 questions. We are only tackling the top 50%, something like that, because of time limitations. But you may look up the complete survey at the BCI website, of course. If we see, for example, here there's a big light blue bar, and light blue means already implemented or implementing. Then there are smaller bars considering implementing, not considering, unsure, and not applicable. So we talk about the questions or the issues which have very much been implemented, or questions have been positively answered, and we're not focusing on questions which have not been implemented or are considered to be irrelevant. If this is right or wrong, we cannot discuss right here, but what we are seeing this evening is, or what are being presented this evening is just the hit list, the most popular actions that have been undertaken. So let's proceed to the first area, HR staff measures. The first question was, do you have restricted visit and contractor engagements? And as we just have seen, most of the respondents to the survey have responded in affirmative. So there have been measures in place, have put in place to deal with visitors and contractors. I think in most cases, the rules would rather have been, or rather are in the direction no visitors and no contractors. And as I just can contribute from the European point of view or Central European point of view, of course, important or emergency repairs or deliveries or very important activities by staff are of course carried out in the different organizations, but this is on a very reduced basis, and I think the regulations which have been put up, or the plans or the guidelines which have been put up clearly state that only emergency or very important actions should be done in person on the spot, of course. And the next question, I think I put my mouse here, that we have a pointer. Okay, number 2. Is there a plan in place if one or other person is diagnosed with the disease? Of course, again, a majority of the enterprises organizations have responded, yes, there is a plan in place. I think we have to discuss if 2 scenarios: what happens if the infection has been detected in the organization or outside the organization. But in both cases, of course, there has to be an investigation on which other staff members or persons working in the organization have been in contact with this person, of course. Number 3, leave policies to allow quarantining. Normally, if you stay away, or you cannot stay away from your workplace unless you are actually sick. Now we have the case, of course, that people who are perfectly healthy have to stay away. So regulations have to be changed and adopted to deal with this situation, so that absences from the main working place have to be dealt with on an organizational level. I'm thinking, for example, on timestamp machines where you have to check in and check out, and the time or pay is based on your presence time. And of course, with when you are not allowed to work on the premises, there have to be regulations to allow for this new scenario. In relation to this situation, there is of course a scenario for staff, single parents, or how do you call it, dual parents, who have to work from home and have to look after the children if schools and nurseries are closed. I remember this, having discussed this again with in my earlier experience with pandemic plans. We had to calculate, or we had to pinpoint staff who would not be able or possible for them to work, even if they wanted to do so. At that time, there was no lockdown or no work from home, but just as soon as nurseries or schools close, then there is a need to take care of the children, and the family has to care. So even a healthy staff member will probably not want to work at the organization in the normal workplace, but need to stay at home. In this pandemic, where we have to stay at home, this is somewhat different, but the impact to the organization is the same, of course. The staff members which maybe have to be on the premises, working machines or security measures or handling original documents, simply cannot do that in the original way. Dedicated helpline for concerns concerning the disease. As you can imagine, there are many questions on how to behave and what's possible and not possible, or what the organization, the employer wants you to do. And I think a normal contact, a normal telephone number in HR department would not be able to deal with all the avalanche of calls. So planned or not, this demand for information has to be dealt with, and we have to make sure that questions, or some questions, or many questions, can still be dealt with. This helpline certainly cannot go beyond what is technically or medically or possible by government regulations, but there will certainly be, or there's certainly a wave of demand calling for such a helpline to be established. My personal experience, not with HR helplines, but with helplines of telecom providers, or online shops, or government agencies, or city organizations, city departments, is that all those helplines are completely overloaded. So despite the fact that there might be many people available to staff these hotlines, this has been overlooked, and demand has overpowered the technical possibilities. So you have to wait for 10 or 20 minutes before being able to talk to an agent. This is not nice and not fine, but it happens, but it's not good practice or best practice. Yeah, we already touched the subject of key process to be carried out by what they call skeleton staff. Not everyone can be sent home. We will also later on touch the issue of security. So some essential work has to be done, and a proper business continuity plan should have taken this into account, so that even in this scenario, we can manage what is necessary in order to provide security, physical security, logical security, and maintenance of machines or production assets in order for them not to suffer damages when and if production has to restart. The next question, which is quite important, and Tom also mentioned the term new normal. I'm going to use this as well, new normal, in terms of what's a company going to look like after the crisis. And it's, I think, it's my strong belief, maybe a widely accepted belief, that companies are going to look differently as they are from today. And of course, staff is very interested on how things might evolve and what the new normal will look like. Will there be opportunities? Will there be layoffs? Will there be concentration of sites and locations? What are the products and services which will remain? So as soon as company management has made up their mind or wants to discuss the ideas, it's certainly a good idea to keep staff informed. Otherwise, you are giving way to rumors and uncertainties, and this certainly is not helpful under these circumstances. A similar point, as we just have discussed with schools and nurseries, is caring for sick relatives. I'm talking here about people who do not need hospital care. This is apparently the majority of the patients, but this has to be taken into account that, again, we have a scenario for someone who might be able and willing to work, just cannot do it because of other priorities in life. Finally, on this screen, but not on the list, we see the three dots down here. This ends our discussion on HR and staff measures. Organizations are required, put it that way, or should plan for support who actually have been struck with the disease, so that they get some comfort in knowing that they are important and that life goes on, and that they should return because they are needed, and just to avoid that they're just getting lost and forgotten. Okay, then the classics, health and hygiene. Yeah, the big number one is social distancing, which is, I don't know, now carried out by several billions of human beings on this planet. Let me move the pointer. Yes, so they have been, these measures have been implemented, partially driven by governmental decrees, but it's a good practice to follow these measures, which normally nowadays prescribes to wearing a mask and keeping about 1 or 2 meters distance to anyone else, and yeah, wash your hands regularly before and after, let's say, walking into a supermarket, and try to be careful in public transport systems. There's a range of measures to be undertaken. We don't need to discuss it in detail, but this is number one on this list, of course. We also spoke about government decrees or government regulations. Of course, this has to be observed by the organizations or by companies, especially those working with the public directly, like restaurants or hotels or supermarkets, pharmacies, whatever, where a number of people could get in close contact. So the organizations, the companies have to follow what's imposed by the government. There's no choice, and again, it's for good reason. Yeah. Then number 3, we have the famous hand sanitizers. By the way, specialists told me that sanitizing all the day 10, 20 times isn't good for your skin, and your skin, the topmost protective layer is getting affected, and then those viruses might have a better chance to stick on your fingers and palms and whatever. So actually washing with a proper soap is obviously better than just putting alcohol on the skin on a repeated basis. Office cleaning. I'm not sure if this is really a very effective measure, but I'm not a specialist on that. But certainly it looks good if companies, organizations engage in a much more thorough cleaning of the workplaces. They have certainly been cleaned today, but not with the focus of using a kind of or reaching a kind of medical level of cleanliness. We all have seen figures of life expectancies of those virus elements on plastic or on metal or on cardboard. So if this measure is somewhat effective, maybe it's very effective, it certainly makes sense. Okay, the next step is actually, we already discussed that a confirmed case, what has to be done, not only from an organizational point of view, but really from a medical or hygienic point of view. So this has to be undertaken. It must not be forgotten to think about this scenario as well. Yeah, mental health and well-being. It's understandable that everyone is sent home into his or her den to stay there and work there and just look out of the window, and maybe not being allowed to have a walk in outside is certainly a load on mental health. People which might be more sensitive may develop symptoms of helplessness or depression. So we should take care of them and not forget to deal with them. Maybe we are physically separated, but this should not be should not have a dimension of a human isolation, including telephone calls or video calls and other human desires to interact with other human beings. So this is a good example for HR to deal with these people. There was no question taking into account physical health and well-being. I would like to add on this moment that I strongly believe, and I think it's not completely wrong, that a strong immune system, a strong physical health is a good protection against contracting or being heavily affected by the virus. So nobody thought about this question in this questionnaire, but I think we are free to discuss that as well. The statistics show that people who are not in best health due to medical problems in their life or at their old age are very vulnerable to this situation. So the whole stuff of suppressing the diffusion of the disease is actually having many healthy people around. I think then the outcome would be much more different instead of what you have seen in some places where many handicapped, physically handicapped, I mean terminal ill or very old people have succumbed to this disease. Yeah, it goes in a similar direction, yeah, to keep up a team spirit, of course. If teams work together all day in certain in an office, and now they have all been told to disperse. Where's the team spirit? So not only top down from management, there should be contacts into these teams, but teams should organize themselves to remain the close-knit team spirit. Yeah, okay, not high on the list, but still implemented by a certain percentage of companies is a non-handshake policy. This is also common knowledge, and it's good common sense. It's a bit a question why it's not on the top of the list. So I don't know the figures, but it appears that maybe a third or a quarter or 50% of the companies have not enforced this non-handshake policy. But we know better. Okay, travel. The question is, have you implemented a domestic travel plan to other meetings and events, international travel plan? Yes, of course, this is again a good practice. And apart from not being allowed to travel, there's all the problem of not being able to travel. I think public traffic or public transportation within a country, long distance, or to other countries, be it by road, rail, or air, is just not possible. So even if it were possible, and maybe it's going to be possible in a couple of weeks, there should still be the issue of being exposed during transit and at your destination. So probably even if and when, let's say, air travel will be possible again, travel bans will still stay for some time. Okay. Where we go here? Okay, the closed offices, yeah. Probably it's important to tell people that they must not come to the office unless approved by top or senior management. It's a good practice which has to be observed, and it makes sense that it's put down in an internal company policy, of course. Okay. One scenario is returning from a high-risk area. Then, well, most countries anyway say, okay, you have to go into quarantine 14 days. I've learned in Kuwait, it's 28 days. So again, this is so we're taking into account to make sure that social distancing has to be enforced. Again, inter-office travel ban, I think it also is helpful to avoid travel within different locations of an organization. Hoping that today's technology with teleconferencing, like the tool which we are using today, can somewhat help to overcome the situation. And actually, from my point of view, I'm taking part in a training course with a club, and I'm very happy that I don't need to travel to the club's offices, spending 1 to 2 hours travel time, but I can now do it from my home, which is an upside of this this pandemic for me. Yeah, travel guidance, alternatives. So those who really have to work have to be specially treated, and these travel policies have to be put into in operation in place. Technology, we touched this also today. Yeah, the first is a classic, I think, where and if possible, conference calls. It's on the top of this list. So many organizations have embraced this technology. And yeah, I guess that after this crisis, work from home and conference calls will stay. Maybe not mandated, certainly not mandatory and 5 days a week, but as some organizations already practices today, maybe we only would go to the office 4 times a week or 3 times or whatever, depending on the job profile, of course. But people have become accustomed to that, and according to local statistics, let's say a large minority, 30% or so, really like it and don't want to abolish it completely. Yeah, one of the more hotter items is cybersecurity in a work from home environment. The question is, ensured staff have cybersecurity measures in place? And obviously, according to this survey, many organizations think they have mastered it. But still, for me, it's a question how to mix equipment and sensitive documents in a private environment, on a private notebook, in the living room or in the garden, whatever. It's has to be properly inspected, and I guess cybersecurity has been affected by the work from home principle. I guess that attackers are not sleeping and are not less busy during these times. And if I look at different warnings in e-banking and online shop sites, there is an attack activity going on. Maybe not only on the technical level, but also on the human level. I'm talking about phishing and impersonation of IT representatives asking innocent workers to divulge secrets. So when you're in a working at your workplace, you might be a bit more sensible. But if you're at home and maybe you're not feeling confident with your equipment, and somebody tells you, yes, okay, I'm from your IT department, do you have problems, and so on, then it might this might be an avenue for an attack, of course. Yeah. Technical issue covering peak and non-peak times. I think that in some circumstances there is a problem with overload, and it's up to the IT to deal with it. Yeah. Communication, again, it touches the subject which we already talked about, the isolation syndrome. How can I easily talk to other people? Of course, during the office, I can walk over to the other office, or we meet each other over lunch or whatever. This doesn't exist. Is not possible right now. So I have to call somebody, and the other one might not be here, or there are social media to exchange messages. So this has to be regulated, and a good solution be found. Cybersecurity in mass staff absences. So I'm thinking about empty offices, empty production sites. We have to think about security, physical, logical security in these circumstances, in this scenario. Medical advice, we talked about it, and there is here in this question, it's a technical perspective of this question. How can this actually be done? Do we have to set up a special website? Do we use social media messaging systems? How to inform the distributed workforce working from home about what's going on in the company. Probably email is fine, but maybe this is not enough or not efficient enough. Yeah, help desk. Every help desk I'm calling today, or in these times, they tell me are overloaded. Many calls reach us, so this is certainly an issue to be observed. This is new. It's a new environment for 95% of the staff, and many of them might be not experienced with working from home. So the impact, or the load or overload on the IT help desk has to be taken into account. Again, communication in case staff becomes infected. I don't know why it's here in IT technology and telecoms, but maybe it's we're not talking about informing the public, but informing again all the staff, all of the place, to inform that one other staff member has been infected. So that's a technical side of the task to inform staff. Again, mail or messaging, this is up to the company. Yeah, supply chain, there are not so many questions, but nevertheless, it's very important. Yeah, hopefully companies have identified, set up a list by now of critical suppliers. Here we go. If they have done proper business impact analysis, they should have the list, and if not, they might have found out now or by now who is a critical supplier. Anyway, planning ahead would have been nice, and we now have to adapt to the situation that maybe a critical supplier is not able or willing to produce to deliver what we need. So we have to get in contact and maybe switch to other suppliers. Suppliers, maybe if I switch to this point, who are closer to us, somewhat reducing the transportation or the risk that the supply chain would be broken. If a supplier sits in a remote country and is willing to produce or has produced what we need, but there is no flights or no sea shipments for those goods, it's of no advantage, you know. And the good old question, which every business continuity approach should contain, is ask your suppliers what is their business continuity plans, or what are their undertakings to ensure continuity of service. Maybe again, from today's point of view, it's a bit late, but it does not. It serves maybe as a wake-up call, and should we should be in better shape if and when the next pandemic might come upon us. By the way, I've been told, or I have discovered, put it that way, in the field of epidemiology, people show or have shown that the frequency of occurrence of these pandemics is increasing. If my memory serves me right, there were about, let's say, 80 pandemics in the 20th century. No, it's 80 pandemics in the 2 centuries before ours. And in 200 years, there were, let's say, 60 or 80, something like that. And in the 20 years of this century, there have already been, I don't know, 20 or 30. So the impacts are coming closer and closer. And hopefully this pandemic is a wake-up call that nobody says, oh, we don't know, maybe it's on our plans, but let's shift our focus somewhere else. Okay, yeah, business continuity plans. These plans serve to actually handle the crisis, and one of the challenges is of course the question, where do you get your information from? So you have to set up a source or array of sources to get your information from, and act accordingly as an enterprise, as a company, as an organization. Of course, it's you have to listen to your government, but there are other loud and low volume signals you have to observe and have to take into account. So looking around what the situation is quite important. Maybe as opposed to, let's say, an IT breakdown, you don't have to look at what the news are, but in this case, where many parts of the world are heavily affected, it's quite important to have to get a good overview. Yeah, incident management teams, of course. It's according to the ranking, it's already done. It's quite important. In most cases, the incident management teams have been activated. They have been deployed. That's fine. A question in this case is, how sustainable is the business continuity response? If we talk about a normal crisis, okay, one supplier, which is important for me, is affected, but I can maybe after a week or two switch to another supplier. If there's an electricity problem, probably it will be back within several hours or maybe 1 or 2 days. So the horizon of the crisis is can be anticipated and can be expected. But with this crisis, this is a different game. If we say, okay, we stop production, and we let's say a physical impact to a production side, we stop production, we can rebuild it, or we have a continuity plan, we move it to another location. We have an idea, we have a time frame, okay, let's say within 1 or 2 or 3 weeks it's over. It has to be over because of the impact to our bottom line, to our reputation, whatever. But in this situation where we are now here, we don't really know when it's going to be over and where, and what the outcomes are, what the scenarios are at the end, because so many people and organizations are impacted. So the sustainability of the response, the teams and the plans is quite important. Yeah, as we also heard from in Tom's presentation, are the plans up to scratch or not? We'll find out if this has been undertaken. Same question is, did we do a business impact analysis recently, which highlighted the prolonged impact of weeks and months? I guess it has not been done, or not by many organizations, but it's important to highlight the length of the crisis, of course. Yeah. If you look at the future, the scenarios of outcomes and the impacts, we are in a crisis, but crisis also offers opportunities. We have heard from Tom. CEOs are thinking on merger and acquisition, so the weaker will be incorporated, will be bought, or their assets be integrated. So it's not all gloomy, but there might be possibilities as well, and it's underlines the scenario, the view that we have to think about a new normal. So nearly no organization will go back to what they have been like in, let's say, early or late December. We discussed that. What's the modeling for the organization post COVID? It has to be planned, and the opportunities to be taken into account. Horizon scanning, we think of dealing with this crisis, but isn't it imaginable that something else might materialize caused by this crisis? I have no real examples, but obviously a number of organizations thinks about it, and it might well be to the good or to worse, but we'll see. Maybe one example, long-range travel. We have now a health crisis, okay, which might be over within a certain time frame. But what about, let's say, the future demand for long-range passenger planes, or for holidays, for tourism? This we may live in a different setup in a couple of months from now, and this plays into the preceding points of going to think about a new normal. Okay, we are nearing the end of the presentation. I want to thank the BCI for including or for producing this survey. It further reading can be done on the BCI website, and the survey can be downloaded. The web address was shown earlier. We are now starting Business Continuity Awareness Week, and maybe this is a small contribution to this Business Continuity Awareness Week. And if nobody is actually aware of business continuity, this should then be the opportunity to do so. Thank you very much for your attention. In the end of my presentation, I'm relinquishing the sharing of my screen and give the control back to our host. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't know if we have any questions from the audience. If yes, okay, we can do the same way we have done it before, by raising the hand, and we'll give the mic to anyone who has a question. Otherwise, we will proceed to Jean, and we still have the chance at the end to have questions. Okay, I'm just looking if there's any question now. Okay. I think we can. Okay, we have a question.
Yep.
Can you please state the difference between enterprise risk management and BC, business continuity?
I have a specific view on this area. Let's put it that way. Risk management looks at the risks, which is very important, and there's no doubt about it. It has to be done professionally and with a very sophisticated means. We have seen in the presentation of Tom, we should use more modern tools than we did in the past. But for me, enterprise risk management is not so much focusing on the actual mitigation and treatment of risks, but this is for me business continuity. Continuity is prescribing in all international standards. You have to do a risk assessment, but it's not enough, and therefore business continuity focuses on the really detailed and really important, let's call it mitigation measures, on the continuity strategy, which trickles down to all the documents of and resources of actually handling a crisis, starting with an impact analysis. So it's a different angle, a different approach, focusing very much on treating business interruption risk or business interruptions. Enterprise risk management covers all other risks which business continuity does not put into narrow focus. ERM is maybe financial risk, currency exchange risks, workforce, competition, marketing, whatever. BCM concentrates on business disruption and focuses on response, preparedness and response. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. I think now we can start with Jean. I don't see Jean.
I'm here.
Okay, good to have you.
Thank you.
Jean Rawi, she has worked full-time in the business continuity industry for more than 25 years and has served on several technical committees that formed leading practices and industry standards used today. She has developed and implemented global business continuity, organizational resilience, and enterprise risk management programs for the World Bank Group, the IMF, the VeriSign, the world's internet infrastructure provider, and many different public and private sector organizations. I just want to remind that we need to finish by 11. We can have an allowance of maybe 15 minutes just for the audience because they were promised to conclude by 11. So if you can make it within that time frame, Jean, because we have another speaker now after you. Thank you very much. You may start now. Thank you.
Thank you. Happy Ramadan, everyone. Many thanks for giving me the opportunity to share with you this presentation on effective leadership, especially during COVID-19 crisis. And while I'm sharing with you leading practices for effective leadership during this pandemic, these concepts apply to every type of crisis, incident, emergency, disaster, or event that a management team might face. So I'll be covering a lot of ground now in a short time to make the most of your time. And it's my sincere hope that you'll actually glean some pearls of wisdom in the time that you invest today. So what we're going to cover, if you're a member of a crisis management team and it seems a little bit chaotic right now, then this presentation will hopefully help to clarify priorities for the crisis management team and actually ground you in what needs to be addressed and in what order it needs to be addressed. So my goal is to help you to how the most effective leaders manage and address stakeholder expectations in times like this. So we're going to cover at a really fast pace leadership in a crisis, 4 expectations of a leader, hallmarks of an effective crisis management team or effective management teams, and also the benefits. And then we'll look specifically at a crisis management team, plan activation, the crisis management plan activation, what the priorities for action planning when the team meets should be. And then I will cover very quickly the top 10 COVID-19 planning activities that should be addressed right now. So right now, many organizations are facing uncharted waters globally with respect to steering this ship during the COVID crisis. And we're facing information overload, such dismal statistics on fatalities, talks of flattening the curve, supply chain shortages, chaos from government leaders. We expected them to sort of already be ready to handle something like this. And now we've got a new acronym, remote work, working from home. People are using terms like the new normal that was mentioned earlier. I've been asked personally from a client, when are we going to be able to pivot back to the old normal? And we're facing adversity, and that's an understatement. But we also face the opportunity to demonstrate effective ongoing leadership to sail through these uncharted waters together. So to begin, when I was the business continuity manager for the World Bank, the crisis management team met once a month. And we invited one of the months, Major General Vincent Bowles, who was from the United States Army, he's retired now. And we asked him to come and speak to the crisis management team on effective leadership. And he came, we were thrilled he came, and this is paraphrasing, not his exact words, but he said, you cannot be a good leader when you want to be. You have to be a good leader when they need you to be. And I believe now is that time where every organization leaders, they need to be a good leader. They can't wait. And he shared 4 expectations of a leader. The first, to establish structure. The second, to manage relationships. 3, balance risk. And 4, make decisions. So I'll go into each of those briefly, just to give you an idea of what he meant. So as mentioned in the 2 prior presentations, your organization should already have an established business continuity teams, business continuity structure. And you should have a crisis management team, which typically consists of the senior management leaders responsible for the coordination and the response of the overall efforts, the response and recovery efforts for your organization. And there should be a primary and an alternate for each member representing key areas within your organization. The second point that he made was to manage relationships. I think the most important thing today to remember is people come first. This is a lesson that I learned from managing disasters for more than 25 years. And it is this: if you do not take care of your people, they will not take care of you. They will not help you take care of your business. An example that I can give you is when the 2009 swine flu pandemic broke out in Mexico City. I was actually in the crisis command center with the crisis management team, and I had been at the World Bank for maybe 2 months, I believe. And the incident commander was instructing staff to alert the media that our mission would continue in Mexico. We would continue to support the programs and the projects that we were busy with, and help the community. Anything underway, we would not stop. And I raised my hand, and he said, "What?" And I said, "Well, I'd just like to make a suggestion that first we send a message, instead of to alerting the media that our missions will continue. I think we probably need to alert the staff. We need to send a message to our staff, firstly, that their safety and security comes first and business comes second. And he looked at me and he paused, and I thought, oh my goodness, I need to update my resume, my CV. I think I probably shouldn't have said anything. And he said, no, she's right. Do what she said. And from that point forward, whenever we met, the crisis management team met, the first thing he asked about were the safety and security of staff and what sort of messaging needed to go to staff. And then the business came second. The other points on the slide are actually lessons learned from my own experience in managing relationships during past pandemics that I'm sharing with you. Managing relationships with public authorities and the medical and healthcare workers, communicating to staff consistently. There's a need for clear expectations of employees. This is a lesson learned through other pandemics I've supported, in that some of you may have gone through the exercise of determining who your critical and essential employees are. And some people, even though they've been deemed that, may not necessarily accept that or want that responsibility. Rewarding, not penalizing people for following safe practices. Sharing health messages. When people don't get enough information, the rumor mill gets fed and people start to feel panic, stress, anxiety. It goes back to what Dr. Marr was talking about making sure that there's emotional health as well as physical health. Establishing flexible leave, remote work policies. Consider bonuses for critical and essential staff if business continuity plans are activated and they accept their mission to come into work. Providing supplies. Monitoring staff that are coming back from travel. When I was working with the UN Women, and we were dealing with one of the first Ebola outbreaks. We were very concerned about staff coming back from travel from the areas that had been impacted. And also for the crisis management team and for your critical and essential staff, beware of becoming pandemic weary. Many, many times the crisis management team would meet and just, they were so tired of meeting that we could become very, very complacent and realize we didn't know everything that was going on. So we wanted to make sure that we did not become complacent or lazy, because we got pretty tired of meeting every day. I also wanted to share with you a few key concepts and principles regarding crisis communications. For anyone who's listening on this call, if you're responsible for communications during the pandemic, it's important to realize that pretty much everything you learned about strategic communications or marketing or public relations messaging and internal communications goes out the window in a crisis. There's a whole science body of research behind crisis and risk communications and what happens to a person's brain in a crisis. I'll give you an example. If you've ever been to a doctor for yourself, a new doctor for yourself or one of your family members, think about how much time it took for you to make a decision before you trusted that doctor, or if you thought, maybe I need to get a second opinion from a different doctor. In a crisis, people will make a decision whether or not they trust you or whether or not they trust your organization and its messaging in the first 9 to 30 seconds. And we have a saying, once that decision, someone's made up their mind about that person or that organization, we say it takes pretty much an act of God. It would be easier to put one shovel of dirt in the ground at a time and move a mountain one shovel at a time than it is to have someone change their mind. It's really, really important to know that in a crisis, that people want to know that you care before they care about anything you know. They don't care about your competence, your expertise, even how transparent, how honest and open you are, or that you have a degree from Oxford, or that you've been doing this for 25 years. People want to know that you care about them. This is a study done by Northwestern Kellogg School of Management. And it has consistently shown that people care. They really want to know that you care. And that has to be factored into your crisis communications. When people are stressed and concerned, they typically, as I said, they want to know that you care about them before they care about what you know. They have difficulty hearing, remembering, and understanding information, and they make rapid decisions, and they're very, very resistant to change. So it's really important that you get your messaging very, very focused. Also, when people are stressed or concerned, they focus more on the negative than the positive. If you think about your own personal experience, if you've had a bad experience at, like, say, a bank, or trying to return something at a store, if you have a bad experience, people tend to repeat that experience, I think, if memory serves, 13 times more to people than they have a positive experience. People also in a crisis process information well below their educational level. It's typically 4 levels below. And people actively seek out additional sources of credible information. So there are crisis communications message maps that use what's called the 2793 rule. 27 words delivered in 9 seconds or less, and 3 core messages. Studies have shown that people in a crisis, they can only remember 3 messages versus 7 things when they are not in a situation of high anxiety, high stress, and low trust. When I was at the World Bank, we used to use this 2793 rule to create our messages. An example would be, there's a suspicious package in the building. Public authorities have been notified, please evacuate. People remember, typically, there might be a bomb in the building, get out. And then normally, when they're leaving the building, maybe they'll see the public authorities and they say, oh yeah, they said they were calling. Excuse me. This slide represents the speed at which communications, risk and communication information flows through the media. So when people typically have questions about a disaster or a high stress issue, they will look for places to get information. 40 years ago, it took about a full day for someone to find a source claiming to be a subject matter expert, or they might call family or friends or listen to the news to get all the answers to their questions. 25 years ago, because of the internet, that time period shortened from 24 hours to 4 hours. And since 2004, because of social media, Facebook launched in 2004, YouTube launched in 2005, Twitter in 2006, Instagram, I believe, in 2010, and here in the Middle East, actually, WhatsApp reigns for texting. But there's also many smartphone applications, and we have information overload. But assuming that you're following credible sources, it takes now, with the advent of social media platforms, the average person gets the answers to all of their questions in 4 minutes or less. And of course, you will always get a lot of misinformation because someone is always claiming to be an expert. So what do you think, some of the problems of the speed of information flowing in 4 minutes? And the answer is rumors and misinformation. So if I want to go and buy a car, do you think I'm going to go to 10 car dealers and test drive cars and waste my time? No, I'm not. I'm a prosumer. I'm going to go online and compare and research car model information and prices before I even go to negotiate the price. And I'll read reviews posted by others if I order something. Because of globalization of the world's economies and the rate at which information flows online, many corporations now actively monitor their social media platforms, and they have procedures in place to respond very quickly, especially in a crisis. And I thought it was important to spend a few minutes on crisis communications because of how important it is. The third point that Major General Bowles said is leaders need to be able to balance risk. Decisions are highly consequential and not easily made. They'll genuinely contain dilemmas. There will be uncertainties. You will not have the answers. You will not have all the information that you need to make a decision, but you have to make a decision relatively quickly, and you'll be faced with ethical and moral dilemmas because you don't have all the information. During the terrorist attacks, 9/11 terrorist attacks, the U.S. government, they were faced with whether or not to shoot down a commercial airliner of innocent victims or risk the unknown. And right now, all you need to do is turn on the TV and witness the ethical and the moral decisions that world leaders are being faced with right now. And from a business standpoint, you all also, leaders have to make decisions, and these decisions need to be made quickly, given the dependencies internally and externally. And the crisis management team, they have to collaboratively weigh those risks as well as the opportunities when they're managing a crisis. And this should not be done in a vacuum. The fourth on Major Bowles' list was make decisions. And in both of the prior presentations, there was a theme of management needing to make decisions. So we have two old sayings: look before you leap, or he who hesitates is lost. Which is the best choice and why? The information should flow between the crisis management team, and that information needs to be validated, verified before a decision is made, but you can't take a really long time to do that. So that's where it's very, very important for the management team to balance risk while they're making decisions. And again, oftentimes you won't have all the information that you wish you had to make that decision. Hallmarks of effective crisis management. A CMT, a crisis management team, has to be well organized in order to effectively manage incidents. And it has the following hallmarks. There's a manageable span of control, meaning that if let's say we were not managing the COVID-19 response, we were managing a cybersecurity attack, we probably would not need to have the entire crisis management team assemble, but just those information technology, information security staff, those responsible for communications. You might not have to pull the whole team together. Number two, common terminology. You want to make sure everyone understands that we're using the same terminology, nomenclature, that it's scalable to the organization. We have an integrated communications. There should only be one or maybe two groups responsible for internal and external communications. There are many, many case studies of where organizations have made the mistake of not having integrated communications, and the message that was received internally by staff differed from what was received by external stakeholders, and it has caused market share loss along with reputational damage. A unified command structure. The great thing about having unified command structure is being able to quickly determine action plans and have comprehensive resource management. You send your resources, your limited resources, where they're needed the most. Some of the benefits you understand in a crisis management plan: the assignment of responsibilities, decision-making authority, communication lines for those stakeholders, internal and external. You should also have some checklists available as well. Other benefits, the flow of information, both vertically and horizontally between all groups at all levels, is very, very important at the highest levels. And it's especially helpful if you have that crisis management team when you have multiple locations and you need to share information quickly. Other benefits: there's coordination between groups, rapid mobilization of resources. You can also see there was a mention of looking in the first presentation today, of looking at trends and patterns and how do we use this information to go from preparedness to actually being able to predict patterns and what the future might hold with respect to risk and opportunities. Also, having crisis management structure that's effective will minimize confusion. I'd like to talk very quickly about if your crisis management team is meeting right now and if they are struggling with focus. That the next few slides are representative of the top 10 recommendations just from a personal perspective on what the crisis management team should be focused on or have already focused on. The first is, of course, the crisis management team needs to be activated. They need to address the current threat, the situational awareness. Infectious disease prevention activities was also mentioned in the prior two presentations. It's not just the government's responsibility or the healthcare industry's responsibility to mitigate the spread of this virus. We all of us have to do our part, and we have to partner with them. We've got to be proactive, and it's been clear that the COVID-19 pandemic has become a call to action for many organizations that had not previously thought about it. We need to look at, the crisis management team needs to look at other preparedness activities that are needed, think ahead, impacts or potential impacts to the organization. We should be monitoring, Tim mentioned earlier, the lead indicator, sorry, Tom, on potential issues and future issues. I'll give you an example. During the 2009 pandemic, while at the World Bank, we purchased Tamiflu for our staff, and we got it shipped to Mexico City. But what we didn't realize was Tamiflu was a medication prescribed by doctors and dispensed by pharmacists, of which we did not plan for. And so we had this immediate impact of, okay, we've got the medication, it's prophylactic, people won't get as sick, but, oh, hey, guess what? No staff will take the responsibility for playing doctor and actually dispensing it to all of the staff and the eligible dependents. So point well taken earlier about looking at potential impacts in the future and trying to plan for those. Crisis management team before the end of every meeting should determine what actions need to be taken before the next meeting happens, determine what resources are needing, and then also to establish a regular situational report. In the industry, they're referred to as sit reps. So I've been here in the Middle East working for 4 years. Most of my clients are in Africa and here in the Middle East. And I've attended crisis management team exercises and some real world meetings where there was really no focused approach to running a crisis management team meeting, and they lost a lot of time. And they either didn't have a fit for purpose crisis management plan, or the plan did not contain appropriate procedures or checklists to follow, for the team to follow to focus on what was important. So I'm sharing with you an order of priority. When a crisis management team comes together to do action planning, people concerns are always first. Some examples are there on the slide: staff, visitors, supply chain, vendors, contractors on site. And then once you've addressed the people concerns, then next on the list are immediate communication concerns, and those are internal followed by external. It's really important that staff or employees know what's going on before it's external, because they might actually get a phone call before they get an internal message. So it's important to have that priority when you're sending out communications. Assessing impacts to the facility, as well as systems, networks, your telecom, there's your IT, your voice and data networks, and then impact on your critical and essential services. At the end of every action planning meeting, the crisis management team leader should be able to answer these questions. What do we need to do? By what time? By whom? And also, what resources do we need? And then when are we going to meet again? So from the time that we meet now until the next time we meet, we call that an operational planning period. So we are trying to decide what will get done before the next operational meeting happens, the next action planning. Number 2, activate a crisis communications plan. This is a leading practice and industry standard that a crisis communication plan that identifies your internal, your external stakeholders. It has pre-scripted messages for the most probable scenarios. And I did recently update a pandemic plan, and had pre-scripted messages as well for this, and they use them. Identify the modes of communication. You know, are we going to use a mass notification software package? Are we going to just send emails? Are we going to use SMS text? You know, courier pigeon, smoke signals. How are we going to get this information to people? It's important, if you have a crisis communications plan, to actually test and exercise it, and then communicate with your key stakeholders about your planning efforts and be proactive. The purpose of a crisis communications plan is to inform and educate, to build and repair trust. You want to persuade and convince people, you know, that their well-being is well in hand. There are 3 communication challenges that I will share with you when you're crafting crisis communications messages, which are cultural diversity, message timeliness, you know, time is of the essence, and coordination and consistency, and then also social media use. Making sure that you have up-to-date contact information. All staff should have their information to human resources, whatever database, however you keep it up to date. And also you need to make sure that you have up-to-date external stakeholder contact information. And it would be needed, if there are changes to contact information that impacts updating plans, crisis management plans, business continuity plans, ITDR plans, etc. It's also important to address, and again, this is a resounding theme, smart health awareness campaign. During the swine flu pandemic, the World Bank and the IMF, we had one shared health services division, and they received an extremely high volume of calls. And while we had communicated health awareness, we had hand washing signs, you know, cloth hygiene, we advocated presenteeism is not cool. I'd actually created a remote work guide for staff to work remotely. We used everything we could at our disposal to communicate to staff. What we didn't realize was that our health services division was going to be overwhelmed with an extremely high volume of calls with people asking medically related questions. And within 24 hours of the crisis management team meeting, our IT staff worked out with health services and our human resources to set up a hotline that staff or their eligible dependents could call with questions. And IT set up routing of the calls to nurses that human resources had hired with the assistance of health services. And the nurses were working remotely out of their homes on shift work so that they could answer the high volume of calls. And we did that because we were in more than 186 countries, and help was available 24/7. And it took an incredible amount of work and time that was better spent caring for sick people, just having that in place. Critical and essential staff designation. This is just an example. It's important to assign and ensure staff agree to what category that they're going to be. And this is just an example where category 1 are staff that can perform mission critical or time sensitive activities, and they have to be on site, versus those who do but can work remotely. Category 3 staff don't support mission critical or time sensitive, but they could work remotely if they were equipped with IT access and hardware and software. And category 4, that they don't support mission critical or time sensitive work and they cannot work remotely. It's important to do this, especially if you're in physical security, because you need to know who's allowed to come on site and who's not allowed to come on site. There are other reasons to do it. Sometimes they're related to insurance. Having department-specific checklists with pandemic planning responsibilities. Human resources, public relations, crisis comms, your environmental health and safety, your facility staff that are responsible for cleaning, IT staff and information security staff, making sure that staff who are able to work remotely have the appropriate, they're equipped to work remotely and successfully. I actually, and after this pandemic occurred in Mexico City, we actually after that had a lessons learned. We conducted a remote work exercise for more than 9,000 staff to make sure that that if it happened again, that we would be ready. We'd stand at the ready. Making sure that travel staff have a checklist, that we reroute mail, shipping, receiving if needed. Corporate security needed to have their own pandemic checklist, and finance for emergency purchases had their own checklist. So if you have realized that you have pandemic specific activities for these different groups within your company, now would be a good time to have them put together a checklist so you don't have to create it again. Number 7, ongoing situational awareness. In the prior presentations, it was called horizon scanning. The crisis management team should know on a daily basis what's happening in the region or the area or wherever they have a presence, an office, a physical location. If there are any mandates or changes required by the government, working with the public authorities to make sure that they have good information. Life safety, what are the impacts to people? How many people are sick in our organization? How many are absent? How many are scared to come to work? How many are quarantined versus isolated? How many are in the hospital? Facilities, think about what kind of issues do they have, not just today, not just tomorrow, but next week, 2 weeks from now. Do they have enough supplies? Are the housekeeping staff trained on how to properly clean? Do we need to order additives to strengthen the cleaners that we use? You know, what are our corporate neighbors doing? You know, do we share a building with others? What are they doing? Corporate security. Are staff trained to not only protect themselves, but also others that are coming into your facility? And do they even know who's allowed to come on site in case, you know, you've activated your work from home, your business continuity, and people, you know, if someone's just coming in just because they wanted to, you know, pick up a spare set of car keys that they left in their desk, are you going to let them do it? Information security. Have they ensured that the Category 2 staff can work remotely successfully? You know, did they test the capability? How are they monitoring an increase in cyber attacks? Because there definitely have been. And speaking of reliable sources, making sure that your crisis management team has a solid, credible health sources that facilitate situational awareness and facilitate their ability to make good decisions with good information. This slide just shows a few that I recommend. Number 8, we've all heard and we've all felt the pain, probably not only professionally but personally. Supply chain dependencies, business partner impacts. There needs to be, if you haven't done that already, to complete a supply chain assessment, not just for right now, but looking on the horizon where you can see gaps in deliveries or inability to continue to provide, and looking for other strategies. It's important to communicate with your critical and essential suppliers and address collaboratively issues. Can they deliver? Did they activate their business continuity plan? Are there going to be any delays? Do you have any workarounds? You know, what's the strategy? So every organization needs to understand their supply chain strategy, and it needs to be communicated. Number 9, updating business continuity plans and strategies. That was resonating through one of the slides earlier regarding the BCI's survey. And I have a few points, and they probably are repeated of what was already covered. But what's important is to clearly communicate expectations to staff. This photo was taken, I have a terrible sense of humor. I use funny signs occasionally. And while diesel is good for your car, fried chicken, I love fried chicken. If you put diesel fried chicken together, it probably isn't going to taste good. Really, really important that you integrate the business continuity plans and the work that is being done for prioritized activities, and that is integrated across all groups. And number 10, personal family preparedness. We tend to focus on business continuity, on organizational resilience, but it's very, very important for people, for families to have their own emergency preparedness plan. Follow the health authority advice and ensure that you have a personal emergency plan for your family. For me personally, I've trained and exercised many executive management teams with a focus in the past 5 years, as I mentioned, here in the Middle East and Africa. And it's the focus has been mainly on crisis management team training and crisis communications training. From my own personal experience in planning for and managing disasters globally, even if you don't have the most up-to-date or fit-for-purpose business continuity plans and procedures, if you have an effective leadership team that can manage and lead in a crisis, if you have a solid crisis management plan and a solid crisis communications plan, it makes a significant difference in the response and recovery of an organization and the collaboration and the loyalty of staff. So I will end here. I hope that I finished on time and left a little bit of time for questions.
I think we can leave the questions at the end, much better, because now we will have plenty of time for questions after the fourth one presentation. Tamer, I think we are expecting Tamer now to appear. Yeah, I think it's yeah. We will start with you, Tamer, and we will have questions for Jean and Tamer after this presentation because of the time, Jean. Now, okay, so we'll have plenty of time after this presentation. Okay, so we can start with Tamer now. I will just have a brief introduction. Most of us here, okay, the delegates list that I have seen, know Tamer. He's a partner at Deloitte's Risk Advisory Middle East practice and responsible for Kuwait's risk advisory practice, as well as managing the cyber risk services in Kuwait and Qatar. Tamer is a subject matter expert in business continuity and crisis management in financial services. All yours, Tamer.
Thank you very much. Okay. So first of all, thank you very much for everyone attending the presentation. And I hope I'll have enough time to go through the material I've prepared for today. I believe my colleagues have presented a lot of interesting ideas around risk management in general, business continuity, resilience. So I'll try to focus on the key areas that have not been covered throughout the presentations. And then towards the last section, I will also cover some of the economic effects that we're seeing nowadays and what are the key recommendations for leadership and organizations to look at and to consider during their crisis management planning, as well as looking at the next phases of recovery of their operations. So before I start with that, I will first address a very important question that, in my opinion, is a good starting point for the discussion. So what is BCM and where does it fit in COVID-19 response? So to start with, business continuity management by implementation is a management system that will allow organizations to plan for disruptions and to plan for their continuity of operations during any sort of disruptions. How do we do that? First of all, business continuity assumes that there is a risk that has already been materialized. So I believe there was a question earlier around what's the difference between enterprise risk management and business continuity? And to put it in the simplest form possible, enterprise risk management is a management system that will allow you to look and identify all the risks that can face an organization, And business continuity management is one of the management systems that will allow you to assume a certain risk has been materialized, and then based on the impacts of that risk, how do you plan for continuity of operations? So if we look at the methodology of business continuity management, it is typically split out over 4 phases. The first phase is the analysis phase. And in that phase, what you want to do is that you want to make sure that you have an understanding of internal risk factors as well as external risk factors. The internal risk factors are typically analyzed through conducting a business impact analysis that will allow you to look at your internal processes and then identify which of these processes are considered critical. And then from there, you can identify what are the key resources that you will require to enable the continuity of these processes. But we also need to look at the external risk factors, and the external risk factors is something that you can have an idea about when you conduct a risk assessment, or what we call a threat risk assessment, meaning that you look at all sorts of risks and threats that might be impacting the organization from an external sources, similar to natural disasters, as well as pandemics, epidemics, and multiple other sources of risks that might be impacting the organization. The combination of internal and external risks will allow you then to identify the key processes that you will need to continue at those, if any of these risks have been materialized. And then you move into the next phase of developing your recovery strategies and your plans. And if you look at this slide in the presentation, just at the heart of this slide and the methodology, plan development starts after you identify what are the recovery strategies that you want to implement. And then looking at what sorts of plans you will need to develop, you have 2 types of plans. You have the operational continuity plans that focuses on your internal resources and how would you plan for having them. And there's also the high level or the strategic sort of plans, the similar to emergency response plans, crisis management plans, HSE plans, as well as pandemic and epidemic planning. And then once that is done, and once we have all of these plans in place, starts the process and the phase of rolling out such plans to the entire organization. And this is basically where you start embedding the business continuity within the culture of the organization through trainings, through assigning champions in all of the departments, and actually running business continuity in your business as usual. Because if this is not done, this is the worst timing ever where you need to look at business continuity, because at this point of time in COVID-19 response, the majority of organizations who are managing to go through a relatively sufficient source of response have already predefined business continuity plans in place, and through their crisis management plan, they decide how do they want to invoke business continuity plans and how do they want to look at continuity of their operations. And the last part of this methodology is basically to look at how to continuously evaluate and prepare for aligning your business continuity management to leading practices. But now let's have a look, how does that combine at the times of crisis? Because I think as Jim mentioned in the previous presentation, this is the time where actually leaders are going to be judged. And this is the time where resilience as a component starts to appear by multiple factors. So leaders are going to be judged for who they are, what are they doing, and when are they doing it. So basically, to start with, there are 5 qualities of a leader that distinguish between surviving a crisis and thriving amidst a crisis. First, they will need to design from the heart. What does that mean? It means that they need to seek and reinforce solutions that align to the purpose of the organization, the social obligations, and to serve the heart of the organization. And for that, there are multiple qualities that will need to be there within the leaders. Also, putting the mission first, stabilizing today and harnessing both the energy and the constraints, because in such volatile conditions, there is an opportunity to spark the innovation and be thriving tomorrow. Speed over elegance, and I think this is a common quality that the majority of the presentations addressed. At times of crisis, it is very important to be to consider the speed at which you're making decisions. That does not mean that you should not be considering a lot of factors. On the contrary, you should. You should be looking at risks. You should be looking at impacts. You should be looking at supply chain. You should be looking at technology capabilities and multiple others that I will discuss in the coming slides. But it is extremely important as well to have appropriate mechanisms to allow for speedy decision-making. So speed over perfection. And then it is extremely important to own your narrative. What does that mean? Owning your narrative meaning that you will be able to paint a picture that will allow you to convince your stakeholders and to convince everybody that you're dealing with and you're aspiring to gain trust, that you will be able to handle the situation and that you will get every support that you will need to make it happen. It is also important to embrace the long view and to always think on multiple aspects, short-term, mid-term, and long-term. Stay focused on what's there in the horizon, making sure that you have the right intelligence, the right data feeds that will allow you to install confidence and steadiness across the ecosystem of your organization. So resilient leaders are also defined by what they do. And these are along 3 dimensions. First, how do we look at priorities? What are the time frame that we require to do so? And how do we establish accountabilities? So if you look at this slide, you will see that the response to COVID-19 is going to be split across 3 phases over a time frame. It starts with responding to the situation, and then you move into a phase of recovery, whereby you learn and you consume all the data that you have analyzed through the response phase, so that you can recover stronger through a capabilities that is embedded within your organization. And then thriving into the last phase, preparing basically for the next normal and being ready to working based on a new norm. But what are the priorities that all of these 3 stages will cross? So first is the importance of having command center in place. Talent and strategy, meaning people and human resources, business continuity and financing, and how are we going to be able to finance the continuity of our operations, supply chain and its risks, the customer engagement, and how do we interact with our customers? How do they stand today? Are they still surviving? And are they still being able to purchase any of the services that we provide? And then what digital capabilities do we have in place that will allow us to thrive in the new norm? And then to the right-hand side, you will see that there is plenty of accountabilities that will need to be assigned across these 6 functional areas that we might be considering during the time of addressing the crisis. So in this slide, you will see that there are plenty of activities that will be done across the respond, recover, and thrive phases. I'm not going to go into details into each one of these activities, but I'm more than happy to share these. And please feel free to refer to Deloitte.com, because this methodology is available online for everyone who would like to look at it. And these are the set of activities that you will need to look at as part of going through these stages. Around the globe, I believe the majority of the countries around the globe are currently at the end of the response stage and moving towards the recover stage. And there are certain symptoms for each one of these phases that you can understand in order to know where do you stand today. And this is typically based on situational awareness tools that are available that will allow you to understand the health situation in each one of the countries, as well as will allow you to understand where do we stand today from returning back to business. Are there any guidelines that are being provided by governments to continue the operations that we can do, and so on. So towards the end of the presentation as well, I'm going to leave you with a tool that Deloitte has developed called the Digital Map, which will allow you to select a country and then look at all of the restrictions and the measures that have been taken by the country, and then understand where do you stand from all of these phases across the crisis. A brief summary of immediate actions, and I think this is a very important slide to summarize what are the key actions required from the time of a crisis until we go back into business as usual. So the first step that organizations should take is to immediately activate a response office. They might be called differently across different organizations. Some organizations call them the command center, others call them the crisis management team center, and others call them the response offices or coordination offices. So, but the concept is the same. It's the command center that will allow you first to establish leaders' intent for the overall response. And if we're talking governmental sector, you will notice that in a lot of countries, it is the president or the highest authority in the country that is taking the lead role in terms of the crisis leader. And in organizations, you see that the top of the pyramid is assuming that responsibilities, relatively the CEOs of the organizations. Formalize work streams, accountability, and time series actions and goals, and introduce executive dashboards and communications. Also exercise where possible wargaming, because this is where you're going to be actually doing a lot of scenario planning. And this is where you will be able to address what are the best cases, what are the likely cases, and what are the worst cases, and then start developing strategies and recovery plans accordingly. Second item, and this is an estimate of around 1 to 2 weeks time, you start looking at of course, and prioritizing health and safety of the employees and what are the impacts. After understanding how we're going to be managing the situation and establishing the command center, first priority is to make sure that we're handling the health and safety of our employees as a first priority for the organization. And to do that, there should be an early communication, and it should be as often as possible, establishing remote working capabilities and supporting technologies where possible, developing clear protocols and obligations for employees who are at risk, and establishing travel restrictions and preparing for an increased absenteeism and work refusal. In the next slide, you will see that it was you will see that I have leveraged a study that we've done in UK that targets basically the difference between willing to work and able to work. And this is one of the challenges where organizations will need to address and will need to make sure that they are not only taking into consideration providing all the capabilities so that employees are able to work, but also making sure that they have an understanding of who of their critical task force is willing to work at the times of crisis. And then assessing risks, exposure, and triggering contingency plans. So in this phase, you start to identify internal exposures and stabilize heartbeat functions or critical functions, assess critical stakeholder vulnerabilities, customers, vendors, investors, and preparing a proportionate response plan, both on the short term, mid-term, and long term. And then engaging with stakeholders and government agencies. And this should be something that you will do as frequent as possible, proactively identifying the key stakeholders, be it internal or external, customers, investors, board, and then coordinating with the local and national government agencies to make sure that you're up to date with all of the regulations, and then you can tweak where necessary your mitigation plans and response plans. Plan ahead, then plan again, and then plan again, and repeat planning. Always develop a holistic view of possible pandemic scenarios. So one of the key weaknesses that I've noted in the majority of the business continuity management system, so I've been engaged in the implementation of more than 20 business continuity management systems across the region, varying from central banks to financial organizations, governments, public sector, consumer business. And it is unfortunate that one of the key risks in all of these business continuity plans is planning for an extended period of disruption. If you notice nowadays, the majority of the business continuity plans address disruption for a period of 1 day, a disruption for a period of a week, a disruption for a period of 2 weeks. I think the maximum has planned for a month or couple of months. But we are in a situation where we might be extending, where the disruption might be extended for a prolonged period of time. We're talking about 6 months or maybe a year till we go to the complete normal. At this point of time, it's an unprecedented situation. We don't know when are we going to go back to the normal as we used to know it, if ever. And for that, we need to make sure that we have proper planning, and we need to ensure that we repeat the planning exercises for our business continuity management system to take into consideration an extended period of disruption. And how do we change the operating model of our organization to adapt to the new norm? This is basically the survey I was referring to in the earlier slide, and in here you will see that this is basically the source of this is Deloitte Public Health in England, as well as King's College London, have participated in a survey, and the output of the survey is that 55% of those able to report to work during a pandemic are willing to work, meaning 45% of them is not willing to work. And this is extremely important when planning for the workforce, and to make sure that you consider actually this part as part of planning for critical employees who might be a single point of failure in your processes. Also, when we look at planning assumptions for businesses, and I believe everyone is now familiar with the term flattening the curve, but how does that link to business continuity? As part of the scenario planning exercise, what we need to do is that we need to look at the multiple scenarios, and each one of these scenarios, how are they going to be contributing to flattening the curve? Meaning, if we have, for example, a best case scenario and the curve is flattened, and we have a best case scenario, how is our organization going to respond? But if we are more likely to be in the scenario where the curve is half flattened, what are the impacts and implications, and how is our organizations going to respond? And in worst case scenario, when the restrictions are going to increase for based on the results of that of the output of the pandemic, how do we plan our resources, and how do we ensure that an extended period of disruption is going to change our capabilities and service provisioning? So key takeaways from this section is basically to create a common operating picture for the organization, and as I believe mentioned in multiple presentations before, a single version of truth that will shape the way the organization is going to operate. Establishing a real-time monitoring and intelligence cell that will allow you to get all of the feeds, all of the intelligence that is necessary for understanding the situational awareness, having that situational awareness, enabling rapid decision-making, stepping away from immediate chaos and thinking through medium-term scenarios, and anticipating recovery-related challenges. In the second section, I'm going to focus on bridging to a better future. And in this section, I'm going to focus on the financial impacts and the leadership priorities. So I will try quickly to take you through what are these priorities. So financial impacts. When we talk financial impacts, that means we need to look at our cash flows, and most importantly, can salaries be paid in full and on time? What are the lost revenue and business planning for medium term? Can debt obligations be met? How communicating with the leaders is going to take effect in that aspect? From a customer's point of view, do we understand how it's impacting them? Do we understand how the pandemic is currently implementing our segments of customers? And how robust is their revenue? Are they being supported by the government? Are the companies still supporting them? And this is all going to be driven from the situational awareness and the intelligence that we get on our customers. Communication, do we have formal communication plans with all of the stakeholders, be it internal, external? And do we need to the need to remain connected with our people? Mobility, it's basically addressing multiple questions of, are we being able to engage with the stakeholders on a frequent basis, or as we want to? How are we managing our supply chains? And do we have a geographical coverage in the business? And where are the senior team members based? And would that have an impact on the way we want to operate and our mobility? Technology becomes a very important component as part of our leadership priorities, because this is the survival kit at this point of time, where the majority of the businesses is going to lean on to capture the digital capabilities they've been investing on throughout the last years. So do we have the required connectivity? Are shared file systems already in place? And does remote working from home work effectively? And absolutely, the glue that puts all of this together is our people. How do we monitor our people's health and keep them safe? How are we managing legacy recruitment and plan pay rises, bonuses, evaluation cycles? How do we manage star performance and monitor their productivity? Because these are going to be the key people we will need at times of crisis. So on the short term, it's liquidity, and again, liquidity. So we need to understand and monitor liquidity impact, looking at the cash flow, probably creating a cash flow tracker and forecast spreadsheet that will allow us to include all of the inflows and outflows of cash and liquidity, understand PDC and direct debit commitments, identifying upcoming issues and discretionary spend, managing working capital and profitability, developing a cash flow forecast as well, and developing a plan to collect receivables, trade debtors, and how best to manage inventory and supplier payments. We need also to take advantage of relevant government policies and support, taking advantage of government regulatory support through loan schemes, deferred payments, applying for utility, rent, manipulicity reductions, deferral. And I think in the GCC region, the majority, almost all of the GCC central banks have already provided stimulus packages, and multiple other governmental entities have provided a lot of support during this time. And it is extremely important as part of planning for recovery is that we consider how we want to take advantage of all of this. On the intermediate term, we need to focus on the active projects and current contractual obligations, meaning we need to look at all of our contracts. We need to assess force majeure clauses in our contracts and how can we make benefit of that. Engage in open discussions with counterparties early and fairly to see how can we minimize the impact on the financial aspects. Active disputes and future contracts. So we need to also consider if the pre-existing issues with our contracts are being hidden under the coverage of COVID-19, or are they being treated fairly? We need to develop mitigation plans, B, C, D, as much as we need to take into account all of the scenarios that might be emerging. Business interruption insurance, I think this is a very important point. Check whether policies provide cover for the event that we're currently going through, and ensure you have the systems to capture and evidence the loss of revenue or any additional costs incurred because of COVID-19, because this is something that you will need going into the recovery phase. Notify insurers and demand interim payments on account. Make sure that there is a process that you report this on an ongoing basis. On the medium term, assess impact on sales. Look at your sales cycles, look at your customers, and look at levers from a company's perspective. Although this might be a very risky time, but for consolidators, this might be an opportunity time for a lot of mergers and acquisitions. And what is the medium-term outlook on GDP of the entire country and possibly on certain economies or a certain industry? Assess impact on production, end-to-end supply chain assessment, including all sorts of risk assessments, as well as knowing the ins and outs of your supply chain and what parts of the overall supply chain is going to be impacted and what are the alternatives if the impact materializes. Identify alternative suppliers and have a global perspective so that you have a wider view. Operations in affected areas, how many operating locations are still active? If not, when might they resume service? And what's the capacity and impact of recovery? And the last point is related to the holistic view, the stakeholder management and structure in the new world. Proactively manage key stakeholders. Seek additional funding early as possible, and test the need for more radical restructuring. Don't shy away. As Jenny mentioned, this is the time of making decisions. And if this is going to be for the benefit of your organization, then don't shy away from making tough decisions, even if it requires a complete restructure of the way you operate so that you preserve the organization's purpose and objectives and that you recover stronger from this crisis. With that said, I will just close because I think we don't have more time. I will just close with some remarks. These are basically a couple of good links from my LinkedIn page, and I think we will be sharing the presentations afterwards. The first one is in Deloitte Digital Map, and this is basically something that will allow you to select your country and then have all of the restrictions and measures being provided by the government. And the second one is an article that I've written on leapfrogging to recovery, and it gives a couple of practical advices on how to recover or how to plan ahead for recovery, and what would day one of going back to business look like, and what are the key considerations to be taken into consideration. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Tamer. It was very great presentation, and we appreciate it very much. At this time now, I have two questions for Jean, and then we will continue with Tamer, the questions. I'm not sure, Tamer or Jean, do you see the questions in the Q&A tab?
I can see the questions, yes.
Okay.
I think
Jean, okay.
Yes,
okay, Jean.
there's one question. Yeah. How could one business manage the leadership interdependency of resources management, especially as a subsidiary entity, having a parent company, hence resources are managed externally, perhaps? I need a little bit more clarification on that question, if possible.
Okay, the question is from Mr. Okay, I will allow talking.
Thank you.
Muhammad, I think that is going to be better. Yeah, I think Muhammad Azlan Abdul Rahim is asking some of these questions. Yeah.
Unmute. Okay. Maybe we go to the okay, talking permitted. So, Mr. Muhammad, you should be able to speak now. Okay, we might go for the. Okay. Okay, we can continue to the other question, and okay, it's again for you, Jean.
Okay, it's regarding. Do you think that in such a crisis with unknown duration, that that might be very long, that making sort of green zone areas for commercial purposes would be an option? I know that there are some countries that are actually considering this and have made announcements, India being one, I think Malaysia was another one. And it's my understanding that they are color coding red, yellow, green zones depending on the number of cases of COVID-19 or whether or not it's a hot spot. Is it a good idea? Well, given that you'd have to have a certain amount of control in and out of that green zone area, it begs the question of how would you do that? Because people who have COVID-19, they can be asymptomatic and still carry it and still infect others. You would have to have a very specific way to control that. And the demands of public health, having social distancing, lockdowns, that is the way we prevent the spread of this virus. So again, it begs the question of, leaders having to balance that risk of public health. Do I put safety and security of people first, or do I put commercial interests in supply chain and meeting my obligations to my customers? So they have to balance that risk, because of the demands of the economy. And that's easier said than done. I mean, if you can imagine, I would imagine people would have to eat, sleep, and stay at that commercial facility without their loved ones, without their support, without that emotional stability for a certain period of time. They're going to pretty much work and live where they normally would go to work for maybe a day and then go home and go to sleep. So with that in mind, coupled with having to control who comes in and out of a green zone, Then there's other issues. I'm not a doctor, and while there's talk of herd immunity in lieu of not having a vaccine, without having a vaccine, if we create green zones, I would imagine that might negatively impact our ability to naturally acquire herd immunity. So I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in on my quick assessment.
I think, Jenny, to be honest, from my side, I tend to agree with your view. If I look at if my understanding of the question is correct to start with, my view is that without a vaccine, without a treatment, we don't know if we're going to be going into wave 2, wave 3, wave 4 of this, and what does that require from us, and is this a sustainable way of looking at the solution? Meaning, we will have to take into consideration that at a point of time during this crisis, we are going to inevitably go into that herd immunity, and then the vaccine will need to ease that sort of pressure once it comes. Unfortunately, so far there have been a lot of news about multiple vaccines, but I don't think we're reaching close to formalization of any. I know in the US, remdesivir is the latest. I know in UAE, stem cells are now being also brought to the attention as a possible treatment. But is this something that is ready to use, and would that help in the way we want to structure our response? I don't think so. I think the wise thing to do at this point of time is to plan for the worst and to make sure that our strategy is built on the basis that even if we manage to get through this, learn from the lesson and make sure that for the next one, you're ready for an extended period of disruption.
Yes, I agree. I think the vaccine, or the longing for the vaccine is not the right answer. It will take quite a long time unless there is a great leap in innovation. But the common knowledge as per today is it takes a long time and the virus might mutate. So we are shooting with a very slow weapon to a very fast moving target. So this is just running after the effect, and there need to be something else. I don't know what, but I feel that's not the right vehicle, the right tool.
I think we can conclude with answering the last question that is addressed for Tamer.
Sure, Doctor.
If you check on the,
I think, yeah, absolutely. I think the question was in regards of subsidiaries, liquidity, cash flows, how to differentiate between cost centers, assumption requirement with profit centers, and managing the actual cost, which is usually already taken into consideration within the yearly or mid-term moving budget. So to start with, there are certain obligations, there are certain financial obligations. So at time of crisis, and specifically an unprecedented crisis, the first thing you will need to do is to revisit your entire budget, revisit the financial model that you have planned for a very simple reason, is because the entire demand-supply equilibrium is no longer there in the world, which means the impact on the financials of any organization has changed drastically. And accordingly, the entire operating model of your financials will need to change. And hence, the sections that I covered towards the last part of the presentation, where do you need to look at, what do you need to do in order to revisit the way you are looking at the financials. And I think one of the very important aspects as well, as part of a crisis management planning, there is typically, as part of crisis management plans, an emergency fund that is available at the disposal of the crisis management team, which will be provided for throughout an accumulated number of years. And that emergency fund is going to be at the disposal to facilitate any emergency costs or payments that you will need to pay out, but you will need to preserve as much as possible cash, meaning there will be an impact on the way you will proceed with your budgets.
It's very true.
Great.
Yes, for example, we cannot. The equilibrium is no longer here, so there are discussions. Will, let's say, airline ticket prices be very cheap or very expensive? There will probably be a varying battle between supply and demand, and this puts another degree of uncertainty on the markets. That's right.
There are there are a lot of talks about such sort of a crisis is unpredictable. So a lot of economists are also expecting that there will be a rebound, which might push all of the demand up again once we are through with the critical phases of COVID-19. But no one knows. The answer is that we don't know, and accordingly we plan for the worst.
Yeah, there will be a backlog in supply and demand. That's true. Yes, yeah. Everything has been toppled upside down, and a new equilibrium has to be found. That's right. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, now it's 11:30. We have been now meeting for the last 3 hours. I thank you very much. Speakers, great knowledge, and great delegates. So if you don't have any questions, we can conclude and wish you good night, all of you. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you very much
Good
for
night. Thank
participating.
you. Great
Thank you.
experience.